There's something profound that happens in those quiet moments, just before dawn breaks, when the world holds its breath, and even the boldest among us find ourselves reaching for something greater than ourselves. I've walked among folks from every walk of life, from weathered ranchers whose hands tell stories of decades spent working the land, to city dwellers who've forgotten what it means to look up at an unobstructed sky. And in all my years, I've discovered that the most transformative moments often begin with the simplest acts. Take Sarah, for instance. She was a woman who'd carved out a life for herself on the edge of what most people would call civilization. Her small homestead sat where the prairie met the foothills, and she'd built everything with her own two hands after her husband passed 5 years prior. The cancer took him slowly, and with it took most of her faith in tomorrow. She'd wake each morning with a heaviness in her chest that felt like carrying stones, going through the motions of feeding the chickens, tending the garden, mending what needed mending, all while feeling like she was just marking time until her own story ended. Sarah had grown up in a household where prayer was as natural as breathing. Her grandmother used to say that talking to the Almighty was like tending a fire. You had to keep feeding it small kindling of gratitude and hope, or it would die down to cold ashes. But after losing her husband, Sarah found that the words wouldn't come anymore. She'd sit on her porch in those pre-dawn hours, watching the first light creep across the horizon, and feel nothing but emptiness where her prayers used to live. It was on one of those mornings, when the loneliness felt particularly crushing, that she remembered something her grandmother used to tell her. "Child," the old woman would say, "when you can't find the words, start with what you can see." So Sarah began there, in that place of seeing. She looked out at the vast expanse of sky, beginning to blush with morning light, and whispered, "Thank you for another day." Just those 5 words, spoken to whoever might be listening. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Sarah would be the first to tell you that. But something shifted in those moments when she chose gratitude over grief, hope over despair. She began to notice things she'd been too numb to see before. The way the morning light caught the dewdrops on her fence posts, like tiny diamonds. The sound of her old dog's contented sigh as he settled beside her on the porch steps. The remarkable resilience of her tomato plants, that somehow thrived despite her recent neglect. Miles away, in a town that barely qualified for the name, lived a man called Dutch. He'd earned his nickname not from any European heritage, but from his stubborn insistence on doing things his own way. Consequences be damned. Dutch ran a small general store that served the scattered families in the area, and for 30 years, he'd been the kind of man folks could count on. Then his son got mixed up with the wrong crowd, made some poor choices, and ended up behind bars for something that would keep him there for a very long time. The shame of it ate at Dutch like acid. He'd raised that boy to know right from wrong, had worked extra hours to provide for him, had tried to be the kind of father his own daddy never was. When the verdict came down, Dutch felt like he'd failed at the most important job he'd ever had. The whispers in town were polite but persistent, and Dutch found himself avoiding eye contact with his customers, carrying the weight of his perceived failure like a physical burden. Dutch wasn't much for religion, never. He figured if there was a God, he was probably too busy with more important matters than the troubles of one broken-down shopkeeper. But as the months wore on and the isolation grew heavier, Dutch found himself doing something he'd never done before. He'd get up before sunrise, make his coffee, and sit on the loading dock behind his store. And he'd talk, not really prayer, he told himself, just talking out loud to clear his head. "I don't know what I did wrong," he'd say to the empty air. "I tried to raise him right. I tried to be better than my own father was." And then, because he was nothing if not honest, he'd add, "But maybe I messed up somewhere along the way. Maybe I can learn to be better." What Dutch discovered in those morning conversations was something that would have surprised his younger self. He began to see patterns in his own behavior, moments where his stubborn pride had gotten in the way of real connection with his son. He started remembering conversations where he'd been more interested in being right than in understanding. And slowly, painfully, he began to find a kind of peace in acknowledging his mistakes and asking for the strength to do better. The changes in Dutch became apparent to everyone who knew him. His shoulders, which had been permanently hunched with shame, began to straighten. He started looking his customers in the eye again, even offering unsolicited advice to young parents who came through his store. "Listen more than you talk," he'd tell them quietly. "That boy of yours has something to say. even if it doesn't make sense to you right now. Then there was Maria, a woman whose story intersected with both Sarah's and Dutch's in ways that none of them initially realized. Maria had been a teacher in the larger town about 50 miles east, but she'd lost her position when budget cuts eliminated her department. At 53, she found herself starting over in a way she'd never imagined, taking a job as a traveling nurse, serving the rural communities scattered across the territory. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done. She drove hundreds of miles each week, visiting isolated homesteads and small settlements, providing medical care to people who might otherwise go without. The pay was modest, the hours were long, and the loneliness was constant. Maria had never been married, had devoted her life to her students and her profession, and now found herself questioning every choice she'd made. It was during one of her visits to Sarah's homestead. Sarah had developed a persistent cough that worried her, that Maria first heard about the morning practice that was quietly transforming her patient's outlook on life. Sarah mentioned it almost casually, describing how she'd started each day with gratitude and found that it somehow made everything else more bearable. "I used to wake up dreading the day ahead," Sarah told Maria as the nurse checked her breathing. "Now I wake up curious about what I might discover. It's the strangest thing." Maria found herself thinking about this conversation during her long drives between appointments. She'd grown up in a devoutly religious household, but had gradually drifted away from any kind of spiritual practice as her education and career took precedence. The idea of prayer felt foreign to her now, almost embarrassing. But the idea of gratitude, of starting each day with intention and awareness, that felt like something she could manage. So Maria began her own version of the practice. Each morning before she started her car and began another day of serving others, she'd take a moment to acknowledge three things: something she was grateful for, something she was looking forward to, and something she hoped to learn. It seemed almost too simple to matter, but within weeks, Maria noticed a shift in her perspective that surprised her. Instead of seeing her work as a series of problems to solve and miles to cover, she began to see it as a privilege. She was often the only medical professional these isolated families would see for months. Her presence meant comfort to worried mothers, relief to men too proud to admit they needed help, and often the difference between a minor issue and a serious crisis. Her morning practice had helped her remember that her life had purpose and meaning, even if it looked nothing like the future she'd once planned. The interconnectedness of these three lives became apparent during a particularly harsh winter when a sudden blizzard stranded Maria at Sarah's homestead for 3 days. Dutch, knowing that Maria might be caught in the storm, made the dangerous journey to check on both women, bringing supplies and his own quiet strength to help them weather the crisis together. During those 3 days, confined by the storm but warmed by unexpected companionship, they shared their stories. Sarah spoke of her morning gratitude practice and how it had slowly melted the ice around her heart. Dutch talked about his conversations with the dawn sky and how they'd helped him find forgiveness for himself and understanding for his son. Maria described her daily intentions and how they'd transformed her work from burden to blessing. What they discovered was that each of them, in their own way, had stumbled onto something ancient and powerful. They'd found that beginning each day with intentional connection to something greater than their immediate circumstances had the power to transform not just their mornings, but their entire life. They weren't using the same words or following the same rituals, but they were tapping into the same source of strength and renewal. Dutch, with his practical nature, was the first to point out the practical benefits he'd noticed. "I used to wake up already tired," he said, watching the storm rage outside Sarah's kitchen window, "like I was carrying yesterday's troubles and tomorrow's worries all at the same time. Now I wake up with just today to handle, and that feels manageable." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I used to think that losing my husband meant losing my future, but when I started thanking God for what I could see right in front of me, I realized that my future was being built one morning at a time. I couldn't see the whole picture, but I could trust the process." Maria, ever the educator, found herself analyzing what they'd all experienced. "There's something about the morning hours," she observed. "Before the day's demands crowd in, before we get caught up in reacting to whatever comes our way. It's like we're more ourselves in those quiet moments, more able to connect with what really matters." The storm passed, as storms do, and they each returned to their own lives. But something had been forged between them during those confined days, not just friendship, but a shared understanding of the power they'd each discovered in their morning practices. They began to check on each other regularly, sharing not just the practical concerns of rural life, but the insights and challenges of their spiritual journeys. Sarah's morning gratitude practice evolved into something deeper and more comprehensive. She found herself not just thanking God for what she could see, but asking for guidance on how to use her gifts to serve others. Her homestead became an unofficial stopping point for travelers, and she discovered a talent for listening that helped many people work through their own struggle. The woman who had once felt purposeless after her husband's death now found herself more essential to her community than she'd ever been. Dutch's dawn conversations led him to reach out to his son in ways he'd been too proud to attempt before. Instead of lectures about making better choices, he wrote letters acknowledging his own mistakes and expressing his unconditional love. The relationship didn't heal overnight, but it began to heal, and Dutch found that his store became a place where other parents came for advice and understanding when their own children went astray. Maria's practice of daily intention transformed not just her work, but her understanding of her life's purpose. She began to see patterns in the health issues affecting the isolated communities she served, and she used her teaching background to develop educational programs that prevented problems before they required treatment. Her medical practice became a ministry of sorts, addressing not just physical ailments, but the loneliness and despair that often contributed to poor health in isolated communities. As months turned to years, their individual transformations began to ripple outward in ways they hadn't expected. Sarah's homestead became a gathering place for people seeking refuge from various storms, both meteorological and emotional. Dutch's store evolved into an informal counseling center, where people came not just for supplies but for wisdom and encouragement. Maria's medical practice expanded to include mental health support and community organizing that strengthened the bonds between scattered families. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the one that occurred within each of them individually. Sarah, who had once felt abandoned by God after her husband's death, now felt more connected to divine purpose than she ever had when life was easier. Dutch, who had carried the shame of his son's choices like a millstone, now carried the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his own failures and found grace on the other side. Maria, who had felt displaced and purposeless after losing her teaching position, now knew that every twist in her path had prepared her for exactly the work she was meant to do. They each discovered that their morning practice, whether they called it prayer, gratitude, intention setting, or simply quiet reflection, had become the foundation upon which they built not just each day, but each year of their life. It wasn't that their problems disappeared or that life became easy. Sarah still felt the ache of missing her husband, Dutch still worried about his son, and Maria still faced the challenges of demanding work and financial uncertainty. But their morning practice had given them something more valuable than solutions to their problems. It had given them the strength to face uncertainty with grace, the wisdom to find meaning in difficulty, and the faith to believe that their lives had purpose even when that purpose wasn't immediately clear. They had learned to start each day not with dread or resignation, but with curiosity and hope. The practice had also taught them something profound about the nature of transformation itself. Change, they learned, rarely happened in dramatic moments of revelation. Instead, it happened gradually, through the accumulation of small daily choices to seek connection, express gratitude, and remain open to possibility. Their lives were transformed not by a single powerful experience, but by the quiet consistency of beginning each day with intention and faith. Years later, when each of them looked back on the period when they first began their morning practices, they would recognize it as the turning point when their lives shifted from mere survival to genuine flourishing. They had discovered that the simple act of beginning each day with grateful acknowledgement of the present moment and hopeful intention for the hours ahead had the power to reshape not just their internal landscape, but their external circumstances as well. The morning prayer that transformed their lives wasn't composed of elaborate words or complex theology. It was built from the raw materials of human experience: gratitude for what is, acceptance of what has been, and faith in what might become. It was a practice accessible to anyone willing to rise a few minutes earlier and spend those precious moments in intentional connection with something greater than their immediate concern. In the end, they learned that the most powerful prayer might be the simplest one: "Thank you for this day, guide my steps, and help me be a blessing to others." Spoken each morning with genuine intention, these words became the foundation for lives of purpose, connection, and profound transformation.